Okay, so in this module, we'll be taking all of the changes that we've made, making the final implementations into the project setting, and then creating a new level just so that we can see how all of our changes allow for easy automation of those processes. So to get started in the project itself, the first thing we just need to recap is the project settings. We'll go back into the maps and modes and just double check. I know we had a little bit of an issue with some clashing of the player start and the overridden pawn, kind of like I'd mentioned, you might expect to find in the past. We kind of saw that in action. So we're going to come back here and set the default pawn to now be the BP underscore pawn. If we had other blueprint derived classes, like I said, another important one is usually the player controller, then we could also assign that here as well. Then to have this change kind of take effect inside of our main level, we're going to go into the twin stick pawn. So again, this is the C++ version that we don't want to be using. We're just going to remove this. And rather than bringing in a blueprint version directly into the world, we can now fall back onto the Unreal kind of provided subsystem of the player spawn system. So we'll drag in another player start. Remember, that means that this will automatically be classed as the player 0 or first player possessed pawn, so we don't need to worry about setting up any auto possession or forcing it to default to the first player in that way. So that now means that if we press play, we can gain control of our pawn as expected straight away. Okay, so nice and simple. That all worked. Another thing to remember is this then opens up the flexibility to come straight into our blueprint, start changing things like where the projectiles will spawn, the fire rate that the player has, the movement speed of the player. And then as soon as we've made those changes very quickly and easily in the editor, we can come back in, press play again, and check our results. We can probably see there from that test that the projectile fire rate was a little bit slow. It's a little bit boring to play it when you have to wait a second between shots. So again, nice and simple, we can just drop that straight back down and all of that has been updated and fixed. Likewise, we can do all of that for the projectiles if you wanted to play around with getting the projectiles to be more unique or interesting. And like we've seen before, we can easily select which type of projectile we want to play with and test inside of our blueprint here. So that leaves us one final thing, and that is just that I said we want to create a new map, because one of the other big problems we had previously is that if we wanted to create an entirely new map and we had changed the variables of the player pawn, if we'd been doing some tests with the C++ class in the level, and we'd found that the movement speed was better, higher or lower, we'd need to either copy the classes between levels or copy the values between levels. And again, it's very easy to kind of forget sometimes a value or two. And then suddenly when a player is picking up your game, your character changes momentum or some kind of characteristic between levels. It can be a little bit confusing. Now all we need to do is if we press Ctrl in N, we can get a new map. Just going to choose the default map as it has the lighting and everything set up for us. We won't need to save the changes in this level. In fact, it also comes with the player start. And this will kind of sum up the concept we're going for here of simplicity and quick iteration quite perfectly, I think. So if we press play, again, we can see we're in a brand new level, fully playable. The player comes in as expected with all of those values we've set up, the correct projectile types being used, and we didn't need to change a single thing in this map. So we can now start bringing this into other people can just very quickly dump art assets in a repository. We can swap between the maps. We can try out the new assets that are being brought in, and we don't need to worry about anything about updating the pawn to be the same between them and things like that. So hopefully that's all made sense, and some of the concepts have been quite simple, and the processes and the coding has definitely been very simple, but it's something which I think still gets mentioned and questioned quite a lot. Which kind of thing works where? Some of the documentation is now very good for that. Some of the templates kind of don't go with the official documentation. So I wanted to bring a highlight to those points and kind of use them as an example of where we can very easily take something that maybe already exists, follow some of the newer documentation and guidelines, and really improve the usability, flexibility, and just general development time that you'll be spending on a project. Make those improvements for yourself by sharing the responsibility between Blueprints and C++ in a way that I think is more intended by the Unreal developers. So in this module, we've seen how we can very quickly now make a number of changes by utilizing all of our new Blueprint classes with the C++ exposed properties, and their base class counterparts.